begin now with a live report from CNN's Michael Holmes in Perth. Michael, hello to you. Bring us up to date on this search. Have they pretty much covered the entire targeted search area at this point?
Hey, Don, good to see you. Yeah, pretty much. 95% now officially covered. That's after mission 12 by Bluefin 21 was done. And like all the previous missions, no sign of MH370. Mission 13 is underway as we speak. And it has to be presumed, Don, that once it completes its search of that focused area, then they've not found anything in what was, to them, the most promising area, 10 kilometres, 6-mile radius around that that strongest acoustic signal. And as we've reported, this was the best guess area for the searchers. There was an air of confidence around it. Coming up with a blank will obviously be disappointing, but everyone from search leaders to the Australian and Malaysian Prime Ministers say it is far from over. The search will continue, but clearly other areas now will have to come into play, Don.
All right, Michael Holmes, thank you very much. Our very own Richard Quest sat down for an exclusive interview with the Prime Minister of Malaysia to discuss everything from the government's handling of the investigation to the families of Flight 370. And Richard Quest joins us now. Richard, it's quite a fascinating interview, and we're going to break down your interview with the Prime Minister, starting with the most critical question, really. Why did they fail to track down the plane when it first disappeared?
John, one of the most interesting parts of talking to the Prime Minister today was because of the programme that you and I and the panel have been doing for the last 6-7 weeks. Because unlike anywhere else in many ways, we have really thrashed these issues out. So when I sat down with the Malaysian Prime Minister, and remembering what you and I have talked about so many times, I really needed to know when the transponder was switched off, when the ACARS had stopped, had been disabled, when the left turn happened, right, what did Malaysia's military see?
Now, the military radar, the primary radar, has some capability. It tracked an aircraft which did a turn back, but they were not exactly sure whether it was MH370. What they were sure of was that the aircraft was not deemed to be hostile.
No planes were sent up on the night to investigate?
No, simply because it was deemed not to be hostile.
Don't you find that troubling, that a civil aircraft can turn back, fly across the country, and nobody thinks to go up and have a look? Because one of two things, I understand the threat level, and I understand that either the plane's in trouble and needs help, or it's nefarious and you really want to know what somebody's going up there to do. So as Prime Minister, don't you find that troubling?
You see, I'm coming back to my earlier statement, is that they were not sure whether it was MH370.
Even more reason to go up and have a look.
They were not sure. But it behaved like a commercial airline.
Moving to then when the Inmarsat data is brought to your attention, did you have any doubts when Inmarsat said, and your advisors said, we believe now the plane flew for 7 hours or so, 6.5 hours or so, and this is where it went? Did you must have had quite a shocked reaction.
To be honest, I found it hard to believe to begin with, because how could a plane that was supposed to be heading towards Beijing, they could decide that the plane ended halfway towards Antarctica? It's a bizarre scenario, which none of us could have contemplated. So that's why when I met the team, and mind you, these are the foremost experts in aviation industry. They are the real experts, as you know. They come from the United States, they come from UK, and they were there. I asked them, are you sure? I asked them again and again, are you sure? And their answer to me was, we are as sure as we can possibly be.
Are you prepared now to say the plane and its passengers have been lost?
on the balance of the evidence, it would be hard to imagine otherwise, Richard.
But the significance is that until Malaysia says the plane has been lost, the compensation packages, the next stage of the proceedings under the Montreal Convention can't go ahead. So I ask you again, Prime Minister, are you prepared to say that the plane and its passengers are lost?
At some point in time, I would be.
But not now.
Right now, I think I need to take into account the feelings of the next of kin. And some of them have said publicly that they're not willing to accept it until they find hard evidence.
So, Richard, the Prime Minister does not want to come out and say the plane is lost now out of respect for, he says, the families. But, I mean, do they still believe it's what they initially said, that it's in the southern Indian Ocean?
Oh, yes. There's no question that the PM believes that. He has very high confidence in the Inmarsat data and the pings from the Ocean Shield. And he makes clear, Don, that if that evidence should prove to be inaccurate, well, not to put too fine a point on it, it's all they've got.
Yeah, it is. All right. Richard, stand by. Again, fascinating interview, because I want to bring in my team of experts now to talk about this. Jeff Wise, the author of Extreme Fear, The Science of Your Mind in Danger. Mary Schiavo, the former Inspector General of the Department of Transportation, now an aviation attorney for victims of transportation accidents. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Kay, a retired military pilot with the British Royal Air Force. Jim Tillman, retired American Airlines pilot. Les Abend, aviation analyst and 777 pilot, and aviation attorney Arthur Rosenberg, and of course Jeffrey Thomas, editor-in-chief of AirlineRatings.com. Jeffrey, of course, is in Perth. And let's go to Jeffrey first. What do you make of Richard's exclusive interview? Did the Prime Minister have a good explanation for the way Malaysia acted in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, Jeffrey?
Look, Don, first of all, great interview that Richard was able to get. The Malaysian Prime Minister has given us more clarity, but it's not crystal clear. Some of the answers were still left question marks. But as far as the way they reacted afterwards, he did concede that they didn't handle it as well as they could. But of course, at the same time, he does say, which is true, this disappearance is unprecedented, and many countries would have been challenged by it. But certainly we've got a lot more clarity from them about what's going to happen in the next week or so.
One of the most important pieces of this interview, Michael, I thought, was the Prime Minister saying that military radar tracked an aircraft. They weren't sure that it was MH370, but it wasn't deemed to be hostile. I mean, what do you make of the Prime Minister's explanation to why they didn't scramble jets, Mikey?
Well, first, I think Richard's questions were spot on, but I sense that the Prime Minister was being very economical with the truth. What do I mean by that? I mean, he had two options. He could either declare to the world that he didn't actually see anything, or military radar didn't actually see anything on its scopes, or he could say he did see something, or the military radar did see something, but they didn't act upon it, or they deemed it not hostile, which is a very dangerous move in the post-9/11 order. The aircraft wasn't squawking. It didn't have those 4 numbers on because the transponder wasn't working. It wasn't IFR flight planned. It wasn't VFR flight planned. It wasn't part of routine airways traffic. So there were a lot of reasons why his air defense fighters, his Sukhoi 30s, his F-18Ds, his MiG-29s, his F-5s, should have got airborne to have a look at that. But the important thing is that what hasn't been teased out here is it's not just a case of an unidentified blip and then you launch some fighters. There are a whole plethora of emergency procedures that area radar controllers can take before you get to that point. Things like trying to get in touch with the aircraft on Hotel Fox, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's a dangerous move not to have interrogated this in some way.
Mary, I want to get your reaction to this, you know, as an investigator and the former Inspector General for the Department of Transportation. We would call it hedging, the Prime Minister at least, his reluctance to acknowledge that the Flight 370, that it is lost.
I'd call it Swiss cheese. There are so many holes in that story, and here's why. He said it was behaving like a commercial aircraft. Really? Does a commercial aircraft make it abrupt turnaround? Does a commercial aircraft, now this is what the Malaysians said, I mean, most of us don't buy all this, would it climb to 39,000 feet, descend to 5,000 feet, climb back up to 4,000 feet, go out and around the Indonesian islands and fail to communicate. Nothing about that statement makes any sense. The aircraft, according to the Malaysians, the aircraft certainly did not behave like a commercial jetliner. Anything but. So if it did behave like a commercial jetliner, time to revise their story again.
Very well put. Swiss cheese. Thank you for that, Mary. Arthur, are there legal reasons why he would avoid saying that directly?
Well, I mean, ultimately, he has to say that the plane is lost in order to trigger the remedy provisions under the Montreal Convention. But I just want to go back very quickly. I think we should be upbeat about the Prime Minister's interview with Richard, most notably on the Inmarsat data. The Prime Minister has access to a lot more information than we do, and he expressed belief and confidence in the data that he was given. I say he gets high marks. I think we have renewed confidence and an injection of that in the location of the airplane, and I think we should take away that from the interview.
All right, stand by, everyone. When we come right back, how does the Malaysian Prime Minister feel about his government's handling of the search for Flight 370? His thoughts are next. Welcome back. I'm here with Richard Quest, who sat down for an exclusive interview with the Malaysian Prime Minister, a man currently under scrutiny, the scrutiny of the entire world. So, Richard, the Malaysian government has a preliminary report. They have been criticized for not releasing it. You spoke to the Prime Minister about that and their investigation. Tell us about it.
Yes, the preliminary report. It was actually me that asked at the press conference yesterday whether the preliminary report had been sent to ICAO, the UN aviation body. And yes, it had been sent, and I was told they were still deciding whether to release it to the media. And then a source told me that there was actually a safety recommendation within it that ICAO should look at the benefits of real-time plane tracking. So, frankly, the fact that Don, the fact that they had written a report, hadn't told anyone about it, weren't about to release it, to my eyes, was a very good example of the sort of lack of transparency that people on this panel have been talking about. So, quite simply, to the Prime Minister, are you going to release the report? How do you justify the allegations of lack of transparency?
The country has had a real kicking over the perspective and perception of the way it handled those early days. I think the phrase used in many cases is Malaysia bungled it.
I have to be quite frank with you. I think, first of all, you have to start from the premise that it was unprecedented. We all agree it was unprecedented. It was the most technically challenging, most complex issue that Malaysia, or any country for that matter, and I believe even an advanced country, will have great difficulty handling such an issue. Some of the things we did well. We were very focused on searching for the plane. We didn't get our communications right, absolutely right to begin with, but I think towards later part we got our act together. So I'm prepared to say that there are things we did well, the things that we didn't do too well, but we're prepared. We're prepared to look into it, and we're prepared for this investigation team to do its objective assessment.
In the last 24 hours, we've had a very good example of what the critics say. The preliminary report. Now, not only did Malaysia not announce that it had submitted the preliminary report, it's still deciding whether or not to tell us we had it and to release it, even though it's got a safety recommendation within it. Now, I've covered enough air crashes to know that almost always is the preliminary report published. So what we have here, Prime Minister, is an investigation or a minister who speaks the language of transparency, but the practicalities of seeming to do the opposite.
I hear the voices out there, Richard. So I have directed an internal investigation team of experts to look at the report, and there's a likelihood that next week we could release the report.
Why not release it now? Prime Minister. Is there something in it that's embarrassing to Malaysia?
No, I don't think so, but I just want it to be, this team to go through it. But in the name of transparency, we will release the report next week.
You will?
We will release it.
Okay, so Richard, he said they will release the report next week. So besides the safety recommendation that you mentioned before we played that part of your interview, do you know what more might be in it?
No, not in any great detail, but prelim reports are fairly basic stuff of material. I'm much more interested because other sources here in KL have told me, Don, that now that this process has begun, they'll be looking at releasing things such as the cargo manifest, the updated passenger list, maybe maps and things like that. The Prime Minister said, I hear the voices, and I think that is the most important part here. I actually don't think there's much there that has to be hidden. I actually don't think they've done much wrong, if anything at all. I think we're talking here about an operational, a PR perspective where apparently they've not given confidence in what they're doing.
Mr. Quest, thank you very much. Let's get back to the panel now, back to my experts. Jeff Wise, do you expect this report to reveal much of anything given how little evidence we have?
Well, on the one hand, preliminary reports are usually very short and brief documents that just lay out the very basic facts of the case. However, it was really stunning to hear this exchange between the Prime Minister and Richard, where he was talking about, creating a panel that was going to review this document, which itself, of course, had already been created by a panel of Malaysian experts. So that was baffling. And then to have this remarkable moment where Richard essentially seems to have strong-armed the Prime Minister into saying, okay, I will release it.
Yeah.
So what is in this report that makes them so hesitant to release it? It's pretty baffling.
Jeffrey Thomas, between announcing they'll release the preliminary report publicly and setting up an international team, are the Malaysians finally attempting to be more transparent? I just wonder if they're not used to media challenging authority, and maybe that's behind some of this lack of transparency?
Look, indeed, Don, I think that the media interest, which reflects the global interest, of course, in this extraordinary case, has really overwhelmed the Malaysians. But with relationship to this report, this is being put together with the help of the NTSB, the ATSB from Australia, the ARB from the United Kingdom. I think the French are involved, the Chinese are involved. There are lots of parties to this preliminary report. So, it's already being put together by a team of experts. Obviously, the Prime Minister's got another team to overlook what has been done. I think this report is going to be a really good thing because it's going to clear the air on a lot of fiction which has become fact, and we can go back to square one and say, okay, now we know exactly what happened with this aeroplane to these various points, and that will be a really welcome thing for the coverage of this disappearance.
Jim Tillman, I wonder, though, when we get this report, if it's going to be like some court documents that are released. There are so many black ink marks through it, redactions, that you can't even read the report. I mean, why wait to release it next week?
Well, for the same reason they've done a lot of other things that don't make any sense. I mean, the fact is, there's nothing in that report. There can't be anything in that report that's that startling. I mean, let's face it, we've been startled enough already. So it's not going to be, going to wake anybody up or lose sleep. It's silly, if you ask me, that they have not done it, and it's very, very harmful to them, their story, to their image, and to those families.
Okay, so Richard also asked the Prime Minister about their deteriorating relationship with the families. Let's listen and then we'll talk.
Prime Minister, the next of kin continue to ask questions, and they believe they're not getting the answers. They believe that various technical facts are not being given to them. Can you tonight reassure them that they are being given the information, and if they believe they're not, that you personally will make sure that they will?
I know this is a very, very excruciatingly painful time for them. I understand that. And we've done our best. We did many, many briefings. And we gave them as much information as we could in terms of information that were corroborated. And as I promised, next week, we will release the preliminary report that we sent to ICAO. But the most important information that they want, and sadly the one that we cannot provide, is where is the plane.
So, Arthur Rosenberg, as an attorney, I want to ask you this. What we've heard from Ivan Watson is many of these briefings, these are one of our reporters in the region there, many of these briefings, at least with the Chinese families, have been practically disastrous. Do you think that the Malaysian government will eventually give in to the demands of the families and get them the answers to their 26 questions?
I personally think they do, and I think a large reason why they haven't been as candid as they should be, I think for two reasons. They're not used to being challenged. The officials are not used to being challenged. And I think they're basically unsophisticated with this. I mean, you heard the language from the Prime Minister. This was unprecedented. I think this was, from a technical standpoint, overwhelming for the officials to deal with. I think the fact that they're not used to being challenged carried over into creating an opaque relationship in terms of transferring information to the families. Ultimately, I think their questions will be answered as the Malaysians become more confident in the information that they have. I think the communication channels will ease up and be greased.
Captain Ivan, aside from the obvious answer of finding the plane, what should the #1 priority of the international team that will investigate this plane's disappearance, what should be their #1 priority, you think?
Well, I mean, I think we all agree is finding the airplane and making, you know, the search more definitive for the families. You know, I agree with Arthur. You know, it's an overwhelming experience. This preliminary report doesn't upset me that it's not being released. I think that it's just a simple matter of the government wanting to dot the I's and cross the T's. I mean, this is overwhelming.
Yeah.
So.
It is, it is. Jeffrey Thomas, thank you very much. Appreciate you. Also, great job, Richard Quest. We appreciate you. Everyone else, please stay with us. Malaysian officials have recommended live streaming data from the cockpit. But is that enough? What about cameras in the cockpit? That always sparks a lively debate here. It may seem like a no-brainer. I'm going to talk to a pilot who doesn't quite see it that way. That's next. Malaysian officials announced that a preliminary report on the investigation of Flight 370 will be made public in 1 week. CNN has learned that the report proposes live streaming information from the cockpit in future flights, and this would help lessen reliance on the black box. But does that go far enough? Should we consider cameras in the cockpit? Joining me now is Captain Sean Cassidy, National Safety Coordinator of the Airline Pilots Association. This always sparks a very lively debate on this show, and we talk about this, Captain Cassidy. As a result of this case, there's been renewed talk about beefing up airline security and safety. One idea, streaming cockpit data live from the flight. The NTSB has also called for video cameras in airline cockpits. You oppose this. Why is that?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is take a step back and acknowledge one thing. And the fact of the matter is that we have the safest form of transportation in the history of the world. We continue to have that right now, even with the presence of this issue with the Malaysia flight. And the reason for that is because we have very safety-minded professionals up front flying those airplanes. And we also have a great system in which we manage currently available data.
Captain, I understand that. With all due respect, we have very limited time here. We can always improve safety. Safety is good, but we can make it better. Why do you oppose cameras in the cockpit?
Because we already have access to a tremendous amount of data that the cameras are actually not going to really do much to enhance. Now, if we were able to bridge the technical challenges of having real-time data streamed by thousands upon thousands of aircraft, there's also the issue of managing the data, protecting the data, and also somebody's got to be monitoring that full-time and actually understand the context in which that data is being provided. And I don't think we're ready to go there yet.
You don't think that there are enough people, or that we can find a way to improve safety and find people to monitor the streaming data if it helps improve the safety of flying?
Well, if they were able to figure out all the technological challenges, I think there's other unforeseen issues with having video recordings, especially streamed back to ground stations. And I'll give you one great example. What if somebody was able to get somehow tap into a streamed video from a flight crew, going beyond the privacy concerns, which of course we have grave concerns over that. What if there's a conversation that was taken out of context and then suddenly ended up being put up on the net, and then ended up promoting a lot of hysteria, even with the passengers on board an airplane who might be getting emails via Wi-Fi.
But Captain, there are other modes of transportation. There are trains, there are buses, there are a number of different modes of transportation that have streaming video and have cameras. You have cameras in a number of different places. These cameras do not have to be available to the public. That seems like that you're scapegoating the issue here.
No, actually, the issue has been studied before. The FAA has commissioned a Federal Advisory Commission to look at the data provisions and the data handling. And the last time they looked at it, they said that there's currently not the safeguards in the system to handle video data appropriately and safely. And the other thing is that an airplane, a modern jet, has probably in excess of about 1,000 different data points from the flight data recorder, not to mention the cockpit voice recorder already recorded. You don't see that kind of data stream that's coming from buses and ships and other vehicles. We have a state-of-the-art data management program right now that ensures the safety of the system. The video issue, going beyond privacy concerns, I mean, there's a great expectation of privacy in the flight deck as well.
So what are the, let's talk about the privacy concerns, because everyone from 7-Eleven to even here in the building in the Time Warner Center, in the CNN Center in Atlanta, in the department store that you go into, when you're riding in a taxi, there are cameras in every single profession just about in this country and in the world. Why should pilots be any different? They don't own the plane, they work for the airlines.
They don't own the plane, obviously, but imagine this. If you have two pilots that are basically locked in a flight deck the size of a closet with a video camera constantly monitoring every single thing they say, it's not the same as perhaps a clerk in a store stepping away from the counter or doing something else. And the other thing is, who's going to be monitoring those conversations? Who's going to be deciding whether or not something they say is appropriate or not? And if they miss part of a conversation and take something out of context, is that going to result in some kind of action or direction being given to the crew?
Well, Captain, that's the whole purpose of it. That's the whole purpose of it. You have a board, you have people to review, you have whoever's in the cockpit give their side of the story. It happens in every single profession. To most people outside of the pilot profession, they don't understand the logic behind what you're saying. That's what happens around the world every single day, and pilots seem to be the only ones who are against it.
I think there's probably other professions that might take exception to having full-time video surveillance of all the stuff that they do every day. I'm positive of that. But if we're talking about real-time monitoring, I don't think you would have the ability to get that information, analyze or review it. And let's remember, there's thousands upon thousands of flights that are operating over airspace right now. It's a much bigger challenge than I think people are painting it as. Mm-hmm. Now, if there was a way to provide sufficient protections and sufficient safeguards and ensure that this was not being used as an appropriate tool of discipline, then we could have a conversation down the line. But none of those assurances exist right now.
All right. Captain Sean Cassidy, thank you very much. I'm going to bring in my panel of experts now, and I'm going to start quickly with getting everyone's opinion on this. Should cameras be required in the cockpit? Should they, or just yes or no? Should they or shouldn't they? I'm going to start in order. Jeff Wise?
Say no.
Mary Schiavo?
Yes.
Mikey Kay?
No.
Jim Tillman?
No.
Les Aubin?
No.
We know
We've had this discussion before.
Yes, we have. Arthur Rosenberg.
Absolutely, yes. There's no question about it.
And we'll get into the reasons why after the breaks. After this break, we have cameras everywhere these days. So why not in the cockpit? My experts will tackle that question next. All right, here we go, everyone. Cameras in the cockpit. The idea raises questions of safety, privacy, and of course, money. Back now with my panel of experts. Okay, so I want to start with our pilots here, Jim and Les. A skeptic might say, what are pilots doing up there in the cockpit that they would not want people to see? Les, you first.
Thank you, Don. I know we have a lively discussion about this frequently, but you have to. The question is, what are we doing? Are we increasing safety, or are we making a deterrent for pilots? In other words, like a convenience store security, are we deterring the crime from committing at the 7-Eleven? So what are we doing up there in the cockpit? Are we preventing pilots from doing a nefarious act, from committing suicide? you know, from reading the Wall Street Journal and possibly ignoring emergency bells and whistles? What is it that we're attempting to do? And if it's a live streaming data situation, somebody like Captain Cassidy indicated has to be watching and monitoring. What can that person on the ground do if that is a live streaming data situation? I don't see where cameras are going to assist or be a deterrent in any particular way. And where do you position the camera in the first place?
All right, Jim?
Well, I just think, first of all, it's a ridiculous idea. And most of that starts with something that's outside of the realm of what a lot of folks are talking about. Let's talk about the economy of it. We only have so much money in the till. Let's take that money and spend it for next gen. This is a ADS-B approach that will eliminate the need for a lot of this kind of conversation. You know, if you're not going to do something that's really going to impact safety and make it better and easier and even more economical for the airlines, then let's not do it at all. It's unnecessary. We don't need to have it. I can hear it now. Flaps, hydraulics, makeup. I mean, that's on the checklist now.
All right. Mary Schiavo, what about this argument that Jim and Les are making here? They say that it is a ridiculous idea. What do you think?
This is a ridiculous idea not to have them. You know, the privacy issue is a red herring. The Federal Aviation Administration regulations did away with that a long time ago when they said you have to have 2 people in the cockpit on every commercial passenger flight. Why? Because the pilots engage in constant crew resource management. They must challenge each other all the time. So if they're constantly doing their jobs, they have no time for any privacy-protected activities, half of which require you to be naked to engage in. So we know that's not happening. There's no privacy issue in the cockpit. And if the accidents we've been talking about recently, 9/11, Egypt Air, Silk Air, Malaysia, and Air France, just those 5 alone, there were over 4,200 deaths. That's about the Iraq War. And on those 5 crashes, it was a mystery what the pilots were doing. So when you put it down to raw, hard data, that's a lot of lives lost. And it's just a practical issue when 200, almost 300 accidents, commercial plane crashes, are caused by pilot mistakes.
Les
Makes perfect sense to cut down on them.
Les is about to jump out of his seat. Go ahead, Les.
Thanks, Don. Well, I posed the question to Mary is certainly 4,200 deaths is significant and the family, and we don't even have to get into that. But what would you have prevented with a camera in the cockpit? All you have is an after-the-fact technology that's merely going to assist with the DFDR, the digital flight data recorder, and the cockpit voice recorder after the fact.
Go ahead quickly, Mary. I want to get the other guys in.
Two elements. One, there's an element of deterrence because in many recent crashes, you know, Colgan, Comair, you can rattle off dozens of them. The pilots were busy and engaged in complaints about their airline rather than flying the plane, watch their plane airspeed deteriorate, and if they knew they were constantly monitored, they wouldn't have done it.
I disagree.
Okay. Arthur, are there any legal issues here, pro or con?
There are always legal issues, but let's talk about practical issues here. First of all, nobody wants Big Brother looking at them all the time. But that aside, let's look at 2 situations, an accident sequence and a security situation. For the accident sequence, we have an audio stream in the form of a cockpit voice recorder. We have a data stream in the form of a digital flight data recorder. We have nothing to visually see what is going on in the cockpit. For example, in the course of an accident sequence, a pilot's hands may hover over certain instruments, over certain radio devices, on the yoke, how he's gripping it. None of that is documented unless you have a video. On the security side, to understand what is going on in the cockpit in the midst, I'll give you an example. The recent JetBlue situation about 2 years ago. The captain had a breakdown. The co-pilot was able to coax him out of the cockpit. He locked the door. The captain's running up and down screaming, "We're not going to Las Vegas." To visually see what is going on in that cockpit, in that security situation is important. And then
hurry up. Go ahead.
Okay, and then add on one more thing. The issue of the live stream of the visual, I think, is also a good idea, and it can be triggered along with the idea of flight monitoring if the plane deviates from its normal flight path.
Here's what people don't understand when it comes to pilots being against cameras in the cockpit. If you work for a company, they give you a cell phone. Everything in the cell phone belongs to CNN. They can take it at any time and use it. Everything in the computer and my email belongs to CNN. When I walk into the building, if I show up late or whatever, they can use it for disciplinary actions. That is no different than any other profession, Michael K. Why is it so different for pilots? The director of this show, the audio track, when the director talks to me, it is recorded.
Don.
Go ahead.
Cameras are not the essence of the issue, okay? There are quicker fixes, the time, money, and resource to do what you're indicating we should do.
But we're not saying that. But we're not saying that there aren't other fixes. Hold on. Hear me out. We're not saying that there aren't other fixes. We're trying to figure out why pilots are so opposed to this particular fix.
The essence of the problem, Don, is geolocating or almost near-time geolocating. And that can be done through ADS-B. ADS-B is linked to transponders. Transponders are the single point of failure.
The problem for tracking the airplane. We're talking about the actions of the pilot, not the tracking of the airplane.
The actions of the pilot can be derived from the FDR and the CVR. We've been using this system for years, and to be honest with you, it's not really broken. It's the fact that we can't find the aeroplane is the single point of failure, and we can't do that because transponders can be turned off. Okay. And we can solve that problem pretty quickly.
Okay, go ahead, Jeff Wise.
You know, listen, Don, I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. We all have cameras on us all the time, but you know who doesn't have cameras on them all the time? The CEOs, the president, the people who run things, they don't have cameras on them.
The president does have cameras on him all the time. There's a camera in Air Force One. There's a camera everywhere. But go ahead.
You get my point, though. The people who are in charge don't get watched all the time. Why? Because they're in charge. They're running the show. The pilot of a plane, traditionally, up until right just now, because of MH370, he is the authority. He is the force of law in that he inherits the mantle of the ship's captain, you know, who could marry people and exert the force of law. And so when you start putting the camera on the pilot, you're basically treating him as a potential perp like the rest of us. So I think essentially there's a big symbolic issue here.
I think that's all mindset. I think there's no camera on me in my office. There's no camera on most people in their office, and it's the pilot. The cockpit is not the pilot's office. It's where they do their work. But stand by, everyone. Coming up, my experts are going to answer your questions. That's next. Back now with my experts for a lightning round answering your tweet questions. And the first one we're going to start with is Mary. I have a question here. It is from, I don't have it here. It's the one from Robert. I just got this earlier. Robert says, what happened to Houston, the guy heading up the MH370 search? We haven't heard from him in a long time.
That's right, but he said he would report back when he had something to report, so sadly, I think he's had nothing to report.
All right. Les, this one is from Jason. Jason says, why would a pilot do a 170-degree turn unless the plane was in trouble? If a pilot lost all of his avionics, what would he do?
No, I agree. That's my whole mechanical scenario that I've been leaning toward, is that he did a diversionary tactic heading toward an airport that he was familiar with because of some sort of mechanical problem. If he lost all his avionics, he's still got standby instruments that he can utilize.
Okay, Mary, again, this is a question from Tina. Says, to me, it seems like the searchers are looking in the wrong place. They should go back and recheck the path of the flight. Do you agree?
Oh, I agree they should go back and check the path of the flight, but I do think they have to finish searching in the area where they're looking right now. But I'm suspicious about those radar reportings across Malaysia and Indonesia.
Arthur, Andy says, why so much secrecy about this accident? What are they hiding?
I think that the Malaysians were completely inexperienced and just out of their league with this, and hopefully they'll get on track going forward.
All right. Jeff, a question from Art. A motive, question mark. Why would someone go through all the trouble of evading radar just to crash a plane in the southern Indian Ocean?
Great question. I mean, listen, this is why this is such a huge mystery, and this is why it's been gripping the world for as long as it has. Who knows? It doesn't make any sense. The whole thing doesn't make any sense. We don't know who did it or why or what or anything.
All right, Michael, this is a question from New Yorker, and it says, if the plane landed, can it fly again without being detected? And if so, how would you stop it from being used as a weapon?
Well, I think one of the 9 principles of war, one of them is surprise. And I think if that was actually the case, then whoever the terrorist organization is that's planning on using this as a weapon has lost that element of surprise, because all the area defenses of all the sovereign territories within sort of that part of the world would be heightened, I should imagine. So, yes, it can be landed. If it was landed, I would be very surprised that no one saw it. And so if it was landed, it would have to be at the acquiescence of the government of the sovereign territory it landed.
But do you think that's a legitimate scenario?
I think it's the most unlikely scenario, but we don't have enough information to take any of them off the table at the yet.
Okay, Jim, this is a question on pilots' actions here. Can someone please answer what is SOP if a pilot feels the plane is in danger and he must maneuver to escape a credible threat? Jim Tillman.
Well, I don't know that there is an SOP, because I don't know what you're talking about in terms of that threat. You know, if the threat is in the airplane, that's one thing. If the threat is on the ground and somebody's got something they're threatening you with, pilots have an uncanny ability to believe they're going to fly the airplane safely no matter what. The beautiful thing about the human being is we know how to analyze data, and we know how to make quick and fine decisions.
All right. And just to show that, you see how mad Les Aubin is with me about cameras, I'm going to ask him the same question. Can someone please answer what is SOP if pilots feel the plane is in danger and he must maneuver to escape a credible threat?
You want me to answer? I'm sorry. Do you want me to answer the same?
I want you to answer the same question.
The same question. We have checklists to follow. If it's a mechanical situation, we follow a checklist, and even in a hijacking situation, we have a scenario that we utilize. So we always have some card in our deck that we can utilize.
All right. We'll be right back, everyone.